It really feels like the whole landscape of work, business, politics, everything in the U.S. today is just fundamentally different than it was, say, 40, 50 years ago.
Oh, absolutely.
There's this sense that things shifted profoundly, maybe somewhere around the 1970s.
That's right. And thanks to you, our listener, for sharing some really fascinating material, these excerpts from Kim Moody and Judith Stein. They give us a fantastic way to do a deep dive into exactly how that transformation happened.
Yeah.
We can really explore the U.S. political economy from the 70s onwards using their insights as a guide.
That's exactly the plan. Our mission here is to unpack these sources, try to understand the complex forces that really reshaped American capitalism, labor, the whole political arena during that pivotal time.
Right.
And look, for you, our expert listener, someone who knows this field, let's just cut right to the chase. The core conclusion these sources collectively reveal is, well, it's pretty stark. They paint this picture of a profound, multifaceted transformation starting in the 1970s. Judith Stein calls it a pivotal decade, and that feels right.
It really does.
This was the moment, that post-war era, the one with relatively shared prosperity, managed capitalism, the age of compression that really ended.
Gave way to something quite different.
Exactly. Increasing inequality, massive capital consolidation, growing precariousness, real instability for workers, and a political landscape that just became, dramatically less responsive to traditional working-class concerns. It fundamentally reshaped class conflict, pushing activists to look for new strategies, often outside the usual political channels.
It's a dense history, definitely intricate, but these sources, they give us a kind of roadmap through it all. We're actually really keen to explore the nuances with you.
Okay, let's do it. Let's start by setting the scene a bit. Go back to the period before the big shift. The sources talk about what Judith Stein calls the age of compression. That's roughly, 1947 to 73?
Yeah, about that. And it was a time marked by, relatively mild income and wealth redistribution, but also, and this is key, soaring economic growth.
Right.
And part of that the sources point out, is how this growth was sustained internationally. The U.S. basically used its market access strategically, granting it to allies to, cement Cold War alliances, economic power serving geopolitical goals.
But that strategic use of the market, it started showing cracks, didn't it?
It did. The sources flagged 1971 as a real fire bell in the night moment. That was the first U.S. trade deficit since, 1893.
Yeah, a long time.
A very long time. It wasn't just a blip. By 1973, this age of compression was effectively over. Domestically, you see the start of wage stagnation.
And that stagnation, the sources link it directly to something specific.
Yes, directly to a sharp drop in productivity growth. It began right around then, and significantly, this wasn't a short-term thing. It continued for decades, really until about 1995.
That sudden slowdown after decades of strong productivity growth, that's really fascinating. What about external pressures? What did the sources say was battering the economy around then, forcing new policy directions?
Well, the 1970s were just a turbulent decade globally. You had high oil prices, obviously a major shock.
Of course.
But the sources also really emphasized the growing competition from revitalized economies, Japan, Germany. These pressures clearly demanded new responses, both domestic and international, from the U.S.
And thinking about the impact on people, on workers, the sources make a really important point about how we even measure that impact, right? The official unemployment numbers might not tell the whole story.
Exactly. That's a crucial insight. Focusing only on the annual unemployment rate, it hides a lot.
How so?
Well, using a broader measure, the sources show that even in a year with supposedly high employment, like 1969, a full 20% of workers experienced some period of unemployment during that year.
20%? Wow.
And by 1970, that was up to 23%. And this hit certain groups really hard. Construction workers, for instance. They might have had high hourly wages when they worked, but they could face unemployment nearly a quarter of the time. It paints a much more unstable, precarious picture for a lot of working people than the headline rate suggests.
So connecting that precariousness back to the bigger international picture, how did these economic stresses start changing U.S. trade policy? You said it was used strategically for Cold War goals before.
Yeah. You see a definite shift starting. Kennedy, initially, used trade policy partly to tackle sluggish domestic growth. There was also concern about European mercantilism. The EEC, the European Economic Community, was seen as violating Gaiety rules, imposing quotas.
Right.
But the trade deficit that emerged later, the sources argue it wasn't just, bad policy choices. It was almost an inevitable outcome of using the U.S. market as the linchpin for Cold War alliances. Prioritizing the economic revival of Europe and Japan over strict economic balances, well, it had consequences down the line.
And probably the most dramatic global shock was the oil crisis. What do the sources tell us about OPEC's rise and how that changed the dynamics?
Well, the rise of OPEC power was absolutely pivotal.
Yeah.
You had nationalization movements, Libya, for instance, and then King Faisal of Saudi Arabia using the oil embargo against the U.S. and the Netherlands because of U.S. support for Israel in the 73 war.
A huge geopolitical move.
Huge. It demonstrated a fundamentally new dynamic where commodity producers suddenly held significant leverage. But the sources add a really interesting nuance about the boycott's immediate impact, too. They suggest it was partly made worse by insufficient U.S. refining capacity at that specific time. So it wasn't just the cutoff, it was an inability to process what they did have efficiently, which exacerbated the shock.
That's a fascinating detail, the infrastructure side of it. So how did the U.S. try to push back against this new OPEC power?
Well, they tried to create a consumer bloc, basically, through the International Energy Agency, the IEA.
Did it work?
Not really. The sources note it faced significant resistance. Countries like France, they pursued their own bilateral deals with oil producers, which kind of undermined a unified consumer front.
Right.
And then there was a big conference in Paris called By France, but it ultimately failed because the oil exporters didn't just want to talk about energy. They wanted to discuss all raw materials, linking their new leverage to those broader North-South economic inequalities.
And what about the developing countries themselves? How did their strategy evolve through the 70s, according to the sources?
It's interesting. The sources observed that developing countries initially hoped that this commodity power route, following OPEC's example, would bring progress. But when that proved really difficult, they kind of shifted back towards protecting their own domestic industrial interests. You saw high tariffs in places like Mexico, Argentina, Brazil.
A return to protectionism.
In a sense. And then later in the 70s, the U.S. tried a different tack, wooing the least developed countries with aid and preferential trade access. But often, the sources suggest, this was driven more by strategic geopolitical concerns, Cold War maneuvering, than by purely economic development goals. It shows how deeply these global economic shifts remain tangled up with the Cold War landscape.
Okay, so we've got these major economic shocks, these shifts hitting the U.S. in the 1970s. What's the fundamental political turn that the sources connect to all this? What was driving it?
Right. The sources argue these economic shifts are directly fundamentally linked to a major political pivot, the turn towards what we now call neoliberalism. And a key driver they identify is the sharp collapse in corporate profit rates.
The profit squeeze.
Exactly. It happened from the mid-1960s right through to the early 1980s. And the argument is that capital, which had previously, perhaps grudgingly, accommodated parts of the welfare state and collective bargaining when profits were strong, well, now saw those things primarily as costs to be rolled back.
So the insight isn't just that profits fell, it's that the response to falling profits was this fundamental political and ideological shift.
Precisely. And the sources detail exactly how business reacted. They highlight the rise of really influential organizations. The Business Roundtable, founded in '73, representing the CEOs of major corporations.
A powerful group.
Hugely powerful. And it became central in developing that core neoliberal agenda. Push for deregulation, lower taxes, cut welfare spending, privatize public services. You also had the Trilateral Commission, also founded in '73, bringing together top business leaders with connections across the political spectrum, including Democrats. They really pushed the international free trade dimension of this new agenda.
And at the same time, the way politics was funded was changing dramatically.
Yes. Post-Watergate reforms, maybe unintentionally, opened the door for a massive proliferation of corporate political action committees.
Advance.
This led to a huge increase in campaign money flowing from corporations and trade associations. And the sources make a critical point. A significant chunk of this money started going to a new generation of Democrats entering Congress around this time.
Okay, that raises a really crucial question, one the sources definitely tackle. What was the role of the Democratic Party in this shift towards neoliberalism? They make a pretty provocative argument here.
They really do. They argue quite pointedly that the Democratic Party, even when it had large majorities in Congress in the late '70s, actually began implementing significant parts of the neoliberal agenda under Carter before Reagan even took office.
So not just minor adjustments.
No, not at all. We're talking cuts in social services, corporate tax reductions, increases in defense spending, and really significant deregulation. Think airlines, trucking, and critically finance, which, as we know, had disastrous long-term consequences.
And how did organized labor fare under this Democratic majority? Did their priorities get through?
Not really. Labor's key legislative goals during this period, things like labor law reform to make organizing easier, common situs picketing rights, they were defeated, despite, nominal Democratic control of Congress.
That must have caused frustration.
Huge frustration. The sources mention an internal AFL-CIO memo from the time, basically saying that the supposed 2-1 Democratic majority is pure illusion when it actually came to passing pro-labor legislation.
So the insight is this turn wasn't just reactive. It wasn't just Republicans pushing this. It was partly driven by a shift within the Democratic Party itself.
That's the core argument. The sources contend it was driven, at least in part, by this new generation of Democrats entering Congress. They were just more receptive to, or maybe even actively supported, this emerging neoliberal agenda, perhaps reflecting changing donor priorities, a different economic outlook than the old New Deal coalition veterans.
Can we look at some specific legislative battles that illustrate this? Tax policy, maybe?
Tax policy is a perfect example. Take the debate around the labor law reform bill in 1978. Business mounted intense opposition, and they used an argument that became incredibly common, that strengthening unions would fuel inflation.
The inflation argument.
Exactly. And on taxes themselves, while Carter initially resisted some of the bigger cuts, he eventually went along with bills that significantly reduced the capital gains tax.
Benefiting mostly
The wealthy and corporations. The sources highlight how economists within the administration, like Charles Schultz, were critical. They saw these cuts as wasteful for actually stimulating investment and inherently regressive in their distributional impact.
And this idea that tax cuts were the key, the magic bullet for growth and competitiveness, that really took hold then, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It became the dominant narrative, the frame for everything. And the sources contrast this with countries like Germany and Japan, which actually did successfully use industrial policies and manage trade during this period, unlike the U.S. economy, which was becoming more and more open, more exposed.
Okay, shifting focus just slightly, what about monetary policy during this really turbulent time? Fiscal policy was under fire.
Yeah, the sources highlight that. By the late 70s, there was this accumulating criticism of traditional Keynesian fiscal policy. The old tools just didn't seem to be working against the kind of stagflation, the structural problems the economy was facing.
So what filled the gap?
Well, without a clear alternative consensus, policymakers kind of kept tinkering, doing fine-tuning, even though it wasn't really addressing the deep issues. And into this vacuum, monetary policy gained much more prominence. The big moment was Paul Volcker's appointment as Fed chair in 1979.
The Volcker shock.
Well, leading up to it. He temporarily embraced targeting the money supply, influenced partly by monetarist ideas from people like Milton Friedman, though the sources note even then there were concerns raised about how accurate economic forecasting needed to be for that approach to actually work.
Right.
They also point out something specific. The imposition of credit controls in 1980 is seen by many as a key factor that triggered the crisis in the auto industry.
And then Reaganomics arrives and basically puts this whole shift into overdrive.
Pretty much. Described by the sources with a supply-side flourish, you had the big Kemp-Roth tax cuts. The explicit argument was lower rates would generate more revenue through growth and stimulate investment.
Did they?
Well, the sources acknowledged that GDP growth was brisk after 1982, coming out of that deep recession. But they also critically note that productivity growth during the Reagan years was actually pretty lackluster, and the budget deficit soared. Why? Because the tax cuts didn't generate enough revenue to match spending, despite all the supply-side promises.
What about the dollar? There was that strong dollar policy early on.
Yeah, initially celebrated by some as a sign of U.S. strength. But the sources note that perspective changed by 1985. The strong dollar was hurting exports badly. So Treasury Secretary James Baker and Volcker actually negotiated its decline through the Clause Accord.
Did that fix the trade deficit?
Crucially, no. The sources point out the trade deficit persisted even after the dollar got cheaper, which really indicates deeper, more structural issues were at play that weren't being solved by just manipulating the exchange rate.
Okay, let's shift gears again. How was capital itself reshaped internally during this whole era? The sources talk about massive changes in how firms were organized, particularly through mergers and acquisitions, M&A.
Yes, absolutely. Huge waves of M&A activity. You saw the value just skyrocket from the late 1980s onwards. It hit unprecedented levels by the year 2000, dipped a bit, and then surged again significantly after 2012.
And the key insight here, according to the sources, is that the nature of these M&As fundamentally changed over time.
That's the really important nuance they draw out.
Yeah.
They distinguish the M&A activity, especially from the mid-1990s onwards, from that earlier, say, 80s approach, often favored by private equity, the strip and flip model, basically asset stripping. This later wave was much more about strengthening a firm's core competencies. How? By acquiring competitors, direct rivals. And this strategy, the sources argue, led to a really significant increase in both the concentration of market share and the centralization of capital. Fewer, bigger players dominating many industries.
How does that contrast with even earlier trends like the conglomeration boom of the 60s and 70s?
It's a really stark contrast. Conglomeration was about diversifying into totally unrelated businesses. And some analysts at the time argued that this actually weakened labor's power because a diversified company could potentially ride out a strike in one subsidiary using profits from its unrelated businesses.
Ah.
The later trend, focusing on core competencies and buying up direct competitors, that led to much greater market power within specific sectors, more dominance in their main field.
Now let's connect this consolidation trend to another huge change the sources highlight, the logistics revolution. How did that reshape the connections between production processes?
Yeah, this is fascinating. The sources actually draw a bit of inspiration from Marx here, noting his idea about how revolutions in transport and communication force changes in production itself. They describe this logistics revolution as just a massive reorganization of global supply chains, driven by lean production methods, think Toyota, and enabled by new technology.
And the specific details here for you, our expert audience, are quite something, aren't they?
They really are. It involved this heavy reliance on advanced IT, RFID tags for tracking every item, GPS for location, universal barcoding, electronic data interchange, EDI, between companies, all geared towards making just-in-time delivery incredibly precise, minute by minute, at every single point in the chain.
But the sources emphasize this isn't just a neutral technological shift, it has a real human impact.
Absolutely. They talk about the sinister side of technology like RFID, enabling much closer, more granular tracking of employees, and critically, the intense, relentless pressure for speed throughout the entire supply chain. They call it management by stress.
Management by stress.
Yeah. They cite examples, like Union Pacific Railroad cutting the time trucks spent in their yards by 75%. It just illustrates this constant demand for speed, squeezing time out of every step, placed on workers at every single node, ports, warehouses, drivers, everyone.
Now here's where it gets really interesting, maybe even counterintuitive. The sources argue that while this era initially looked like it was about fragmenting production, outsourcing precarious work,
The actual dynamic of competition within capitalism produced the opposite tendency in many ways.
which was
Increased concentration and centralization of capital. In almost every area of production, more and more parts of the process got tied together in these incredibly tightly coordinated, just-in-time supply chains.
even outsourced firms.
Especially them, in a way. Despite appearing decentralized, they become utterly dependent on plugging into this sophisticated logistics network to attract and keep business from the big players. They have to meet the same time pressures.
Okay, so if capital got more consolidated and production got tied together by these super tense, time-sensitive supply chains, what does this mean for workers, for the potential for organized action?
This is where the sources find a potential, maybe unexpected, point of leverage for labor. They argue that this very interconnectivity, this inherent time-bound tension within the supply chains, while it creates immense pressure, a kind of global supply chain gang for workers, it also paradoxically makes these systems extremely vulnerable to worker action.
That's a powerful idea. The idea that the methods capital used to gain flexibility and maybe escape labor power relocation, lean production might have inadvertently created a new, perhaps even more acute vulnerability right in the circulatory system of capital, the supply chain itself.
That's precisely the argument they explored, a real potential contradiction.
Okay, let's turn now explicitly to the impact on labor and how workers and movements have tried to respond to all these seismic shifts. The sources note, as we touched on, the rise in precarious or contingent employment.
Yes, they detail the different forms. Temp agency work, short-term contracts, that bogus self-employment category designed to skirt labor laws, involuntary part-time work. They cite BLS estimates from the mid-90s to mid-2000s showing millions of people in these kinds of situations. Though they add an important nuance. The overall proportion of the workforce in these contingent roles only rose slightly during that specific decade, maybe from 15.2% to 15.5%. Still, for the millions involved, the experience was one of much greater instability.
And how did this precariousness combine with other pressures we've talked about to challenge workers and unions?
Well, you combine that instability with the work intensification,
Hmm.
the management by stress, and the constant pressure from business for concessions, again, often driven by those falling profit rates in the earlier period. It created just huge systemic challenges for workers and for traditional forms of organized labor. The ground rules for unionism really shifted.
And that difficulty, that harder terrain, leads directly to a critical question the sources really dig into: the challenge of political representation for labor, especially within the Democratic Party.
Yeah, they have a whole section they call the Democratic Party cul-de-sac.
Yeah.
And they make a really strong structural argument about the party in the U.S. The core insight is that it is fundamentally not a membership organization like many European social democratic or labor parties.
How do they mean?
They contrast it explicitly with, say, the British Labour Party, where party members can directly elect the leader, like when Jeremy Corbyn was elected. The U.S. Democratic Party just doesn't work that way,
So how do they describe its structure?
as basically a collection of shifting electoral coalitions. It's highly candidate-centered,
Right.
very hierarchical, run by professional managers, and crucially heavily funded by big money.
How much money from labor versus business?
The sources give a specific funding breakdown for the DNC in 2016. Out of nearly $99 million raised by August that year, guess how much came directly from labor unions?
I dread to think.
$66,500.
Wow. Tiny.
Tiny. The vast bulk came from big business, lawyers, lobbyists, wealthy individuals.
And what's the implication of that structure, that funding base, for voters and activists trying to influence the party?
The sources argue it means voters have effectively no direct influence over the party's candidates, its internal organization, or its core policy direction, and very little real leverage over how elected Democrats actually behave once in office. They quote one analyst, Arthur Lippow, who argues this structure makes the party essentially the creature of professional politicians, which is profoundly undemocratic if you think about popular control.
So the key takeaway here is that the structural reality makes strategies aiming to, move the party left or achieve some kind of membership-driven takeover.
Right.
It makes those strategies incredibly difficult, maybe structurally impossible compared to the context in some European countries.
Exactly. That's the fundamental barrier, the cul-de-sac that they identify.
Okay, so given that rather bleak analysis of the Democratic Party route, where do the sources look for alternative strategies, for ways to build social change and labor power in the U.S.? They do explore the idea of maybe splitting from the Democrats.
Yes, they definitely discuss the potential for creating a split as a strategy that's debated on the left. They mentioned the Bernie Sanders campaigns, not just for the policies, but seeing them as representing an opportunity to build a larger socialist movement and perhaps spark that kind of split. They cite figures like Jason Schulman discussing this. And Bhaskar Sankara from Jacobin Magazine and DSA is quoted directly talking about aiming to transcend the Democratic Party entirely. Seeing the internal tensions within the party, the progressive wing versus the establishment, as maybe, just maybe, raising the possibility for a whole different kind of political realignment.
They also draw some parallels to new parties that popped up in Europe after the financial crisis and austerity measures, right?
They do. They mention parties like Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, which definitely emerged out of social protest against austerity. They note these parties act, in defense of labor against capital within the existing system. But the sources also offer a bit of a critique.
What's the critique?
That these parties often struggle because they've gotten the relationship between mass struggle and electoralism backwards and upside down, meaning they sometimes prioritize chasing electoral success over the hard, slow work of building deep, sustainable mass movements from the ground up, which is where real power comes from, according to this view.
Okay, so what does this analysis point towards for strategy here in the U.S.? If the Democratic Party is seen as a cul-de-sac and purely electoral strategies have pitfalls, where do the sources suggest focusing energy to build power?
They argue very strongly for building on the foundation of existing labor struggles and social movement struggles, particularly at the local level. They give examples.
Yeah.
The Fight for 15 campaign for higher wages, Black Lives Matter, immigrants' rights organizations, workers' centers doing crucial organizing, environmental campaigns fighting locally, local union organizing drives, and unions that are already fighting back.
And the idea is these aren't necessarily the end goal, but the starting point.
Exactly. They're seen not necessarily as fully formed mass movements yet, but as the essential material from which bigger, more explosive movements can come. They form the core, the potential base, for any new political organization that hopes to be genuinely rooted in the working class.
And local unions are seen as potentially key in this.
Yes. Interestingly, despite the national union leadership often being tied closely to the Democrats, the sources see potential in local unions. Maybe they could be crucial allies or bases of support for local-level third-party or independent political candidates, suggesting a possible path for independent politics starting small from the ground up.
But actually launching independent or third-party campaigns faces massive hurdles in the U.S. system, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely huge. The sources are very clear about the difficulties, especially at the state and local levels, even where the number of signatures needed to get on the ballot might seem relatively low. Jonathan Martin is quoted noting it can be just 0 to a few hundred for state rep in some places.
Odd.
But actually getting permanent party status, the kind that gives you ongoing ballot access, U.S. laws are described as among the worst in any Western capitalist democracy. Really restrictive.
And what are the main practical hurdles beyond ballot access?
Well, incumbency is just a massive advantage for the two main parties. Campaign costs are constantly rising, especially now with the right wing pouring huge resources into state-level races. And then there's just the basic lack of party infrastructure, name recognition, funding, media attention compared to major party candidates. They cite examples like the limited success for the Green Party nationally, and also look at unique local efforts like the United Working Families, UWF Party in Chicago, which actually backed a mix of progressive Democrats and some genuine independents, highlighting how complex the strategic choices are on the ground.
Yet, despite all these challenges, the sources don't just leave it there. They offer examples of successful resistance, of grassroots power making a difference.
Yes, and these are really important. They provide several compelling cases to show that fighting back is possible, even on this difficult terrain. They mention the inspiring victory of the Justice for Janitors campaign back in the day, the big Verizon strike where CWA Local 1101 played a crucial mobilizing role. Teamster victories that were supported by the rank-and-file reform movement, TDU.
More recent examples, too.
Definitely. The militancy shown by the Chicago Teachers Union, the big fights led by healthcare unions like NNU and NUHW, and even the unprecedented nationwide prisoner strike that was coordinated by the IWW's Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, IWOC.
And the core insight from looking at these diverse examples, what's the takeaway?
Fundamentally, it's that grassroots organization, preparation, and active involvement by union members can make a difference. The sources argue these examples prove that the difficulties of fighting back in this neoliberal era, while very real, they don't create an absolute insurmountable barrier. And importantly, perhaps the new terrain itself, the consolidated capital, the stressed supply chains, might actually open up new paths and opportunities for struggle if movements are organized enough to seize them.
There's one final nuance the sources touch on regarding recent political shifts, specifically that 2016 election and the Rust Belt vote. What was their take?
Yeah, they offer an analysis that argues the Democratic loss in key Rust Belt states in 2016 wasn't primarily due to a massive swing of white working-class voters to Trump, although, a smaller swing definitely did happen.
So what was the main factor, according to them?
Lower turnout among former Democratic voters in those areas. The insight is that disengagement, disillusionment, maybe feeling taken for granted by the Democratic Party were arguably bigger factors than a direct political pivot to Trumpism by that whole demographic. It complicates the simple narratives.
Okay, and connecting all this back to the labor movement specifically, what role do the sources see for institutions outside the formal mainstream union structures? They discuss labor notes, for example.
Right. Labor notes is presented as filling a really crucial vacuum. A vacuum created because the mainstream labor movement was often struggling to effectively tackle the key challenges of the era. Things like how to fight concessions, how to deal with lean production on the shop floor, the lack of internal union democracy in many cases.
And how did labor notes fill that vacuum? What was their approach?
The fascinating insight is how they did it. They focused on connecting activists across different unions, across different industries, breaking down those silos. They provided not just political analysis, helping workers understand the bigger picture, but also really practical help for organizing, famously through their Troublemakers Handbooks, which are full of real-life stories and concrete examples of successful shop floor resistance tactics.
So theory and practice combined, did they operate internationally too?
Yes, that was key. They understood early on that capital was operating globally. so labor needed a global response. They were important in building cross-border links, for instance, between U.S., Mexican, and Canadian workers under NAFTA. Their whole mission, which they stated very clearly, was, let's put the movement back in the labor movement. How? By consciously building a militant minority of informed, active, rank-and-file union members.
This whole deep dive, drawing on these sources, it really paints a picture that's so much more complex than the simple stories we often hear. It's not just economic decline or a purely ideological shift to the right. It's about these interwoven dynamics, capital restructuring itself, specific policy choices being made at key moments, and then the complex, often difficult responses from labor and political movements playing out over decades.
Absolutely. And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, especially for you, our expert audience, the nuanced insights are just critical. Understanding how specific policy debates things that might seem technical were actually crucial turning points.
Like what?
Like Nixon's unilateral economic actions in '71, Carter's pivot towards deregulation and those capital gains tax cuts, the whole debate around industrial policy and why the U.S. largely didn't pursue it compared to Germany or Japan, and then Volcker's dramatic monetary shift. These weren't just technical adjustments. They were actively shaping the terrain of class power. They profoundly altered who bore risks and who captured rewards in the economy.
Yeah, for experts like us, those details really matter. Understanding the difference between, say, that earlier conglomeration M&A and the later core competency-driven consolidation. Recognizing the specific technologies and the intense human pressures involved in the logistics revolution, grasping the structural reasons why the Democratic Party isn't easily moved from within by progressive forces, and appreciating the very real, ongoing strategic debates on the left about electoralism versus building power through grassroots struggle, these are all key to really understanding our current moment, aren't they?
Exactly, because, what does all this mean for us today? These historical shifts, they didn't just happen and end. They literally created the economic and political context we are living in right now. A context marked by that persistent inequality, the immense power of consolidated capital, the profound challenges still facing organized labor, and that ongoing search for effective political strategies, often outside the traditional channels. The sources you shared, they give us this remarkably detailed map of how we got here, highlighting the choices made, the forces unleashed, the dynamics that are still shaping what's possible today.
So just to summarize the journey we've taken through these really powerful sources, we've basically explored how the U.S. moved from that post-war age of compression with its relative stability through the turbulent and absolutely transformative pivotal decade of the 1970s.
Right.
We've seen the rise of neoliberalism, not just as an idea, but as a dominant policy framework. We've tracked the profound consolidation of capital into fewer, much larger entities. We've looked at the increasing precarity and stress facing labor. And we've examined the fundamental transformation of the political landscape, especially the structure and function of the Democratic Party as a potential vehicle for working class interests.
And the real value, I think, is how the sources offer such a detailed account of how these things were all interconnected, moving beyond just surface events to really try and expose the underlying power dynamics and the specific policy choices that drove this massive restructuring of the American political economy.
Okay, so as a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to mull over, building on one of the most, I think, intriguing points in the sources, given their argument that the very nature of modern logistics, its tightness, its time-bound intensity, its interconnectedness, creates this fundamental systemic vulnerability to worker action, a vulnerability perhaps created by capital's own strategic choices. Does this truly represent the most promising new terrain for challenging capital today, in the era shaped by all the shifts we've just discussed?
And perhaps what does the history of past grassroots struggles, the ones the sources highlighted, tell us about the potential but also the inherent difficulties of actually seizing those kinds of opportunities effectively in the current moment? Something to think about.